During an unexpected patrol, officers caught the formidable Jason Statham off guard by dousing him with a downpour of scalding coffee, and the shock of that unforeseen act left him regretting it in mere seconds, forever altering the course of that night. The scream tore through the silence of the courtroom like shattered glass. "You're lying! All of you are lying!" Emma Statham, pale and trembling, stood from her seat in the witness box, eyes wild with desperation. The judge's gavel slammed repeatedly, but the sound only seemed to fuel her frenzy. Two court officers moved toward her with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Statham, you will compose yourself or be held in contempt," Judge Carmichael warned, his voice cutting through the commotion. Emma's gaze darted to the defendant's table where Commander Wells sat motionless, his expression unreadable beneath his perfectly pressed uniform and carefully cultivated compassionate smile. The same smile that had graced countless police ceremonies and community event photographs. The same smile she had trusted. 30 years, she whispered, voice breaking. 30 years of silence, and you're still protecting him. The courtroom fell into a heavy hush. Commander Wells's attorney rose to object, but Wells placed a gentle hand on his arm, restraining him. The calculated gesture wasn't lost on Emma. "Ms. Statham," the prosecutor approached cautiously, "perhaps we should take a brief recess." "No more recesses," Emma interrupted, her voice steadying. "No more delays. I've spent my entire life waiting for this moment." She turned toward the jury, 12 faces clouded with confusion and discomfort. "What I'm about to tell you isn't in my statement. It isn't in any police report. It's what happens when a city decides some people are too important to touch." The prosecutor's face drained of color. They had prepared for months, crafted a careful narrative that wouldn't alienate the local jury, many of whom had known the Wells family their entire lives. Emma was demolishing their strategy with every unauthorized word. "Your Honor, I must insist," Wells' attorney began. "Let her speak," came a voice from the back of the courtroom. Emma froze. She knew that voice. Turning slowly, she found herself looking into the determined face of her brother. Jason Statham stood in the doorway, clutching a weathered journal in white-knuckled hands. "I have proof," Jason said, his voice carrying through the stunned silence. "I've always had proof." Commander Wells finally moved, his careful composure cracking as he lunged to his feet. "This is absurd. Your Honor, this is clearly orchestrated." "Commander Wells," Judge Carmichael's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, "you will be seated." As Jason walked down the center aisle, Emma felt the weight of 3 decades pressing on her chest. Everything, her carefully reconstructed life, her fragile peace, hinged on what would happen in the next few moments. The journal passed from Jason's hands to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. As Judge Carmichael opened the faded cover, Emma closed her eyes, remembering how it had all begun, long before this moment of reckoning. Summer had always been Emma's favorite season in Oak Ridge. At 17, she'd spend afternoons diving into the cool waters of Lake Merritt with Jason. 19 and fearless, racing her to the floating dock at the center. Their laughter echoed across the water, drawing occasional glances from other swimmers. The Statham siblings were inseparable despite their different personalities. Emma cautious and studious, Jason impulsive and athletic. Commander Wells had moved to Oak Ridge that June to take over as head of the local police department. At 42, he was younger than his predecessor and brought ambitious plans to transform the struggling force. Divorced, childless, with an easy charm and genuine interest in community safety, he quickly became a favorite among residents and the city council. Emma first met him during summer community service sessions. She was helping with outreach programs for at-risk youth as a volunteer and college application booster. Commander Wells often observed these sessions, offering guidance and praise. "You have a natural talent for community work," he'd told her one afternoon as they packed up materials. "Have you considered law enforcement as a career?" Emma had blushed, unused to such direct attention from adults in positions of authority. "Maybe. I'm still figuring things out." "Well, I hope you'll consider it. We need dedicated people like you in community policing." The conversation had left her floating for days. Here was someone who saw potential in her, beyond what her parents, loving but overworked, had time to notice. Jason had been suspicious from the start. "He watches you weird," he commented, after picking Emma up from a volunteer session. "He's just supportive," Emma had defended, annoyed at her. Brother's characteristic bluntness. "No, Em, it's different," Jason insisted, his trained eye attuned to subtleties others missed, but Emma had dismissed his concerns as overprotectiveness or imagination. As summer progressed, Commander Wells began asking Emma to help with special projects, organizing community outreach materials, attending police community meetings, preparing welcome packets for new neighborhood watch groups. Tasks that often kept her at the station later than other volunteers, sometimes alone with him in the building. The changes in Emma were subtle at first. She became quieter at dinner, jumped when her phone buzzed with notifications. She started wearing longer sleeves despite the August heat, claiming a sudden sensitivity to sun. Their parents, working double shifts at the hospital and the factory respectively, were too exhausted to notice. But Jason saw everything. The journal Jason now clutched in the courtroom had begun as a simple documentation of observations, dates, times, changes in Emma's behavior, small notes about interactions with Commander Wells that seemed off. August 3rd. Emma cancelled our lake plans again. Third time this week. Said Commander Wells needed help with community outreach folders. Mum and Dad think it's great she's networking. Something's wrong. August 7th. Emma came home with a new watch, silver with a small pendant. Said she bought it herself, but I know she's been saving for college apps. She hid it when Dad asked about it. August 12th. Found Emma crying in the bathroom. She said it was just stress about college essays. Her wrist had bruises. When I asked, she pulled her sleeve down and told me to mind my own business. The documentation became more urgent as summer waned. Emma had tried talking to their parents, but without concrete evidence, her concerns were dismissed as teenage drama. Martin Wells has revitalized that school in just 2 months, their father had said. The board is already talking about extending his contract. You should be grateful your sister has made such an important connection. The final entry. In the journal came the night before the first day of school. Emma had woken around midnight to find Rebecca's bed empty. Panicked, she'd searched the house before spotting headlights through her bedroom window. Martin's sedan was idling at the end of their driveway. Rebecca emerged from the car, moving like a sleepwalker toward the house. Emma had hidden in the hallway closet, watching through the slats as her sister entered, mascara streaked down her face, clothing disheveled. Rebecca had gone straight to the shower, turning the water so hot that steam billowed from under the bathroom door. She stayed there for nearly an hour. August 31st. I don't know what to do anymore. No one will believe me. But I know he's hurting her. Tomorrow I'm going to tell someone at school. Anyone who will listen. But Emma never got the chance. The next morning, Rebecca announced she wouldn't be attending school that day. By nightfall, she'd packed a bag and left Oak Ridge, leaving only a note explaining she'd been accepted to an EDE, early college program across the country. She wouldn't return for 30 years. In the years that followed, Martin Wells became a pillar of the Oak Ridge community. He transformed the high school from an underperforming institution to a model of academic excellence. He established scholarships, mentored countless students, and eventually joined the city council. His charitable foundation provided resources for underprivileged children. There was even talk of naming the new library wing after him. Emma had tried to speak out initially, but without Rebecca's testimony and with only a teenager's journal as evidence, no one took her seriously. After several confrontations with school administrators and threats of defamation lawsuits from Martin's lawyers, her parents had sent her to live with an aunt in Colorado. The sisters' relationship fractured under the weight of silence and separation. Brief, strained phone calls on holidays gradually tapered to Christmas cards, and eventually just social media connection requests that went unaccepted. Rebecca built a new life in Boston, becoming Dr. Hayes, a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma recovery. She never married, never had children. Her colleagues respected her professional boundaries and didn't question why she declined invitations to their homes, or why she always kept her office door open during sessions, or why she flinched at unexpected physical contact. Emma returned to Oak Ridge after college, establishing herself as a local artist despite the whispers that followed her. "That's the Hayes girl who tried to ruin Principal Wells's reputation," people would murmur at her gallery openings. She married, had 2 children, divorced. Through it all, she kept the journal locked in her studio, unable to discard it despite the pain it represented. The breaking point came when Martin announced his candidacy for state senate. His campaign focused heavily on education reform and child welfare. The irony was too much for Emma to bear. She reached out to Rebecca for the first time in years with a simple text. "He's running for Senate." On a platform of protecting children. Rebecca's response came 3 days later. "I'm coming home." When Rebecca returned to Oak Ridge, the town had changed, yet remained eerily the same. New storefronts occupied familiar buildings. The high school had a new science wing, the Martin Wells Center for STEM Excellence. She rented a room at the Lakeside Motel rather than staying with Emma. Their reunion was stilted, weighted with decades of unspoken pain. "You left me here with him," Emma said, as they sat across from each other at a coffee shop far from the town center. "I was 17 and terrified," Rebecca replied, her professional composure cracking. "No one would have believed me. He made sure of that." "I would have. I did." Rebecca stared into her untouched coffee. "I know, and I couldn't face that either." They sat in silence until Emma finally pulled the journal from her bag, sliding it across the table. "I kept records, before and after you left. There were others, Becca." Rebecca's hand trembled as she opened the journal, seeing her teenage life documented through her sister's eyes, followed by Emma's suspicions about other students in the years after her departure. Names, dates, observed behavioral changes, girls who suddenly transferred schools, who withdrew from activities, who changed overnight from outgoing to reserved. "This isn't proof," Rebecca whispered. "It's just observations." "It's a pattern," Emma countered. "And with your testimony?" "My testimony," Rebecca closed the journal sharply. "After 30 years, with no evidence beyond my word against the most respected man in Oak Ridge." "There's more." Emma pulled out her phone, scrolling to a private social media group. "I started this 6 months ago, for former female students. Just to reconnect," I said, "but really to see if anyone would talk." The group had over 40 members. Most posts were innocuous, updates on careers, families, throwback photos of school events. But Emma opened a private message thread with 3 other women. Their stories mirrored Rebecca's with sickening similarity. "They're willing to come forward, but only if they're not alone," Emma explained. "They need someone to go first." Rebecca stared at the messages, feeling the weight of responsibility crushing her chest. "I built a life, Emma, a career helping people who've been through trauma. If I do this, if I face him publicly, I could lose everything." "And if we don't," Emma challenged, "how many more girls will he hurt?" The decision took 2 more days. When Rebecca finally called the district attorney's office, her voice was steady, her resolve set. The prosecutor warned her about the difficulties ahead: limited physical evidence, the challenge of memories after decades, Martin's sterling reputation, the town's likely backlash. Rebecca listened patiently before responding. "I've spent 30 years helping others find their voice. It's time I found mine." The investigation proceeded quietly at first. Statements were taken, old-school records examined. But in a town like Oak Ridge, secrets didn't stay buried long. News leaked, dividing the community between those who couldn't fathom Martin's guilt and those who had harbored suspicions for years but never spoke up. Martin's initial response was a press conference on the high school steps, surrounded by supportive faculty and board members. He expressed sadness over false allegations clearly motivated by political opposition to my Senate campaign. He pointed to his decades of service, the thousands of students who had flourished under his guidance. He even offered compassion to his accusers, suggesting they needed help rather than prosecution. The performance was masterful. Rebecca watched the broadcast in her motel room, recognizing the same manipulation tactics that had once rendered her powerless. The case nearly collapsed before reaching trial. 2 of the 3 women who had agreed to testify withdrew after receiving threats. Evidence was circumstantial at best. The prosecutor warned Rebecca they might have to drop charges. Then came the break they needed. A former school administrative assistant came forward with a box of misplaced personnel files, records of complaints that had been removed from official documentation. Among them, a formal letter from Emma's art teacher expressing concern about Martin's unusually close mentorship of certain female students and requesting that he not be allowed to meet with them alone. The letter was dated 2 weeks after Rebecca left town. The teacher, now retired, confirmed writing the letter and being called to a meeting with the school board where he was. Encouraged to focus on his curriculum rather than administrative matters, he was transferred to a different school the following year. With this corroboration, the case moved to trial. Martin hired the most prestigious defense attorney in the state. Rebecca steeled herself for the brutal process ahead. The defense's strategy was predictable: attack the accuser's credibility, question why they'd waited decades to come forward, suggest collusion between the Hayes sisters for financial or political gain. They portrayed Martin as the real victim, a dedicated educator whose reputation was being destroyed by unsubstantiated claims. By the time Rebecca took the stand, she was emotionally exhausted but resolute. She recounted her experiences with clinical precision, dissociating from the trauma as she had taught her own patients to do during difficult testimony. The defense attorney's cross-examination was designed to break that composure, to make her emotional inconsistent. That's when she spotted him in the gallery, a former student she recognized from Emma's photographs, now a young man in his 20s. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw in his expression the same haunted look she confronted in her mirror daily. The realization hit her with physical force. Martin hadn't limited his predation to girls. It was this revelation that had caused her outburst, shattering the careful process of the trial and bringing the courtroom to this pivotal moment with Emma's journal now in the judge's hands. Judge Carmichael examined the journal carefully before looking up at the courtroom. "This is highly irregular," he stated, adjusting his glasses. "This document was not submitted during discovery." "Your Honor," Emma stepped forward, "I only recently found the earlier entries. They were in a separate notebook I had forgotten about until last night." Martin's attorney was on his feet instantly. "This is absurd, convenient evidence appearing mid-trial. This is clearly an attempt to inflame the jury with unsubstantiated—" "The journal appears to be contemporaneous with the alleged events," the judge interrupted, still examining the pages. "The handwriting is consistent with that of a teenager, and the ink shows appropriate aging." He looked toward the prosecutor. "Does the state wish to enter this as evidence?" "Absolutely, Your Honor." "This is completely inappropriate," Martin's attorney protested. "We have had no opportunity to examine this alleged evidence. The court will take a 2-hour recess," Judge Carmichael decided, "during which time the defense will have opportunity to review this journal. We will then determine its admissibility." As the courtroom began to clear, Rebecca remained frozen in the witness stand, her eyes locked with Martin's. For the first time since the trial began, his mask slipped. The hatred in his eyes confirmed what she had always known. Beneath his carefully crafted persona of compassion lived a monster. The young man she had noticed earlier approached Emma in the aisle, speaking in hushed tones. Emma's expression shifted from surprise to grim determination. She nodded, squeezing his arm supportively before they both looked toward Rebecca. During the recess, the courthouse hallway became a flurry of activity. The prosecutor huddled with Rebecca and Emma, reviewing the newly discovered journal entries. Martin's legal team demanded private conference rooms to strategize. Reporters gathered outside, sensing a dramatic turn in the high-profile case. Rebecca sat alone briefly, gathering her strength for what would come next. Emma approached the young man beside her. "Becca, this is Jason," she said quietly. "He has something to tell you." Jason's hands trembled slightly as he explained how Martin had mentored him during his senior year, offering special academic opportunities that always somehow required late-night work sessions in his office. How the grooming had escalated to abuse. How he'd tried to report it 2 years ago, but was convinced by school administrators that his claims would ruin his college prospects. "I saw your testimony yesterday," he told Rebecca. "Everything you described, it was like you were telling my story." His voice broke. "I can't stay silent anymore." When court reconvened, the prosecution asked to approach the bench. After a lengthy sidebar conversation, Judge Carmichael addressed the courtroom. "The court has been informed that a new witness has come forward. We will adjourn until tomorrow morning to give both sides time to prepare." He fixed Martin with a hard stare. "The defendant will surrender his passport to the court before leaving today." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Martin's face. That night, Rebecca couldn't sleep. She paced her motel room, rehearsing her testimony, preparing for the defense's inevitable attempts to discredit her. Around midnight, her phone rang. Emma. "Turn on the news," her sister said without preamble. Rebecca fumbled with the remote. The local channel showed police lights flashing outside a familiar building, Martin's home. The reporter's voice came through clearly, responding to reports of a possible suicide attempt. Sources confirm that Martin Wells, currently on trial for multiple counts of sexual assault, was found unresponsive by his legal team when they arrived to prepare for tomorrow's proceedings. Emma's voice cut through Rebecca's shock. He couldn't face the truth finally coming out. Martin survived his attempt. The trial resumed 2 weeks later with him present, but noticeably diminished, his confident facade replaced by a hollow-eyed stare. Jason's testimony proved devastating to the defense. Unlike Rebecca's allegations from decades past, his were recent, detailed, and corroborated by text messages and emails showing Martin's pattern of manipulation. 3 more former students came forward after Jason, spanning different decades of Martin's career. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. At the sentencing hearing, Rebecca chose to deliver a victim impact statement. She approached the podium slowly, no longer afraid to look directly at the man who had haunted her life for 30 years. "I've spent decades helping others heal from trauma," she began, her voice steady. "I've witnessed the profound damage that silence causes, both to individuals and communities. Silence protected you, Mr. Wells. It allowed you to continue harming vulnerable young people who trusted you. It divided families, including my own." She turned briefly toward Emma, who sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face. But silence can be broken. Truth can emerge even after decades. And while justice delayed is painful, it still matters. It still heals. She took a deep breath. "I don't speak today for vengeance. I speak for every student who entered your office believing in your commitment to their education and left carrying a burden no child should bear. I speak for the community that will now begin its own difficult healing process. Most of all, I speak for my 17-year-old self, who deserved protection rather than predation." As Rebecca returned to her seat, Emma reached for her hand. The gesture, simple yet profound, bridged 30 years of separation. Judge Carmichael sentenced Martin to 25 years without possibility of parole. At 72, it amounted to a life sentence. As he was led from the courtroom, Martin's shoulders slumped in defeat, the powerful presence he had maintained for decades finally crumbling. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements. Rebecca and Emma walked past them in silence, down the steps and toward the lake that had witnessed their last carefree days together. At the shoreline, Rebecca slipped off her shoes, feeling the cool sand between her toes. Emma did the same. Without discussion, they waded into the shallow water, just as they had as teenagers. "What happens now?" Emma asked, watching ripples spread from their footsteps. Rebecca considered the question, looking across the water to where the town of Oakridge stretched beyond. Many there still couldn't accept Martin's guilt. Healing those divisions wouldn't happen quickly or easily. Now, Rebecca said finally, we learn to live without the weight of silence. She reached for her sister's hand, and together they walked, deeper into the lake, two silhouettes against the setting sun, no longer divided by the past that had defined them for so long.